Part 1. The Revolution. 1. No people in history has had a more tragic development than our own. In times of serious crisis, all other peoples have fought either for victory or momentary setback. With us, the stakes have always been victory or annihilation. Witness our military history from Cleon and Hochkirch to Jena and the Wars of Liberation, when the attempt was made on French soil to win Prussia's allies for Napoleon by proposing partition, to the desperate hour at Nikolsburg, when Bismarck contemplated suicide, to Sedan, which just barely staved off a general offensive of the armies poised at our borders by preventing Italy's declaration of war, to the frightful tempest of wars on our entire planet, the first thunderclaps of which have just died away. Only in Frederick the Great's and Bismarck's states was resistance at all feasible. In all these catastrophes, Germans have fought Germans. That it was often tribe against tribe or sovereign against sovereign is significant only for the surface of history. Beneath all these conflicts lay the intense discord that inhabits every German soul, an inner struggle that first erupted ominously in the Gothic age, in the personages of Frederick Barbarossa and Henry the Lion, at the time of the Battle of Lugano. Has anyone understood this dichotomy in the German soul? Who has recognized in Martin Luther the reincarnation of the Saxon Duke Widukind? What inscrutable drive was it that made Germans sympathize and fight with Napoleon when, with French blood, he was spreading the English idea on the continent? What makes us conclude that the riddle of Lugano is profoundly similar to that of Leipzig? Why did Napoleon regard the destruction of the little world of Frederick the Great as his most urgent problem, and in his innermost thoughts as an insoluble one? Now, in the evening of the Western culture, we can see that the world war is the great contest between the two Germanic ideas, which, like all genuine ideas, are lived rather than expressed. Following its actual outbreak in the Balkan outpost skirmish of 1912, it first assumed the outward appearance of a conflict between two great powers, one of which had everybody, the other nobody, on its side. It reached a provisional conclusion in the stage of trench warfare and the devastation of huge armies. During this stage, a new formula was found for the unresolved inner discord in the German breast. Currently, owing to a 19th century habit of overestimating the economic factor, we characterize the conflict by the superficial terms socialism and capitalism. What is actually taking place behind this verbal facade is the last great struggle of the Faustian soul. At the moment in question, although the Germans themselves were not aware of it, the Napoleonic riddle made its reappearance, with the goal of destroying this masterpiece of a state, our most genuine and personal creation, so personal that no other people has been able to comprehend or imitate it, hating it instead like everything demonic and inscrutable. An English army invaded Germany. 2. Believe it or not, that is exactly what happened. The lethal blow in this was not necessarily aimed by the preachers of cosmopolitanism or other treacherous elements. It was we ourselves who brought about this calamity, we Germans with our almost metaphysical will, our stubborn and selfless determination, our honest and enthusiastic patriotism. This will of ours is by its very nature a handy weapon for any external enemy, with the practical sense of the English. It is a precarious compound of political ideas and aspiration, one which only the English are really capable of mastering and implementing. For us, despite all our passion and self-sacrificing zeal, it has led to political dilettantism. Its effect on our political existence has been disastrous, poisonous, suicidal. It is our invisible English army, left by Napoleon on German soil after the Battle of Jena. Our deficient sense of reality, so pronounced as to have the force of a destiny, has counteracted the other instinct in the German people and has caused our external history to develop as a steady sequence of dreadful catastrophes. It failed us at the height of the Hohenstaufen period, when the glorious rulers considered themselves exalted above the demands of mundane life, just as it did in the 19th century, giving rise to the provincial Philistinism that we have personified as the German Michel. Michelism is the sum of all our weaknesses, our fundamental displeasure at turns of events that demand attention and response, our urge to criticize at the wrong time, our need for relaxation at the wrong time, our pursuit of ideals instead of immediate action, our precipitate action at times when careful reflection is called for, our Volk as a collection of malcontents, our representative assemblies as glorified beer gardens. All these traits are essentially English, but in German caricature. Above all, we cherish our private morsel of freedom and guaranteed security, and we are fond of brandishing it at the precise moments when John Bull, with sure instinct, would conceal it prudently. July 19th, 1917, was the first act in the drama of the German Revolution. Rather than simply a change in leadership, it was, as our enemies could tell by the brutal forms it took, the coup d'etat of the English element in us, which saw its opportunity at just that time. It was not a revolt against the power of an incompetent, but against power in general. Incompetence at the top level? It is nearer to say that these revolutionaries, among them not a single true statesman, beheld the mote in the eyes of the men in positions of authority. Did they at that moment have anything at all to offer in place of incompetence, besides an abstract principle? It was not a popular revolt. The people looked on anxiously and doubtfully, though not without a certain amount of Michel-like sympathy for measures taken against those at the top. It was a revolution of the caucus rooms. The term majority party does not, in our sense, have anything to do with the greater number of the people. It is the name of a club with 200 members. Matthias Erzberger was tactically the most gifted demagogue among them, excelling at scandal-mongering, intrigue, and ambush, a virtuoso at the child's game of overthrowing ministers. He lacked the slightest trace of the English parliamentarian's gift for statesmanship. All he did was borrow their tricks. He attracted a swarm of nameless opportunists who were after some public office or other. These were the late descendants of the Philistine Revolution of 1848. For them, political opposition was a Weltanschauung. These were the latter-day social democrats, trying to function without the iron hand of August Bebel. Bebel's acute sense of reality would not have tolerated this shameless spectacle. He would have demanded and achieved a dictatorship either of the right or the left. He would have capsized the parliament and put the pacifists and League of Nations zealots before the firing squad. This, then, was the storming of the Bastille auf Deutsch. Sovereignty of party leaders is an English idea. In order to put it into effect, one would have to be an Englishman by instinct and have mastered the English style of conducting public affairs. Mirabeau had this in mind when he said, "The time in which we live is very great, but the people are very small, and as yet I see no one with whom I could care to go aboard ship." In 1917, not one person had the right to repeat this proud, sad statement. This coup d'etat was entirely negative in character. It broke the oppression of political power. It refused to yield to decisions from above, but it lacked the ability to make new decisions. It overthrew the state and replaced it with an oligarchy of party subalterns who regarded opposition as a vocation and responsible government as a presumption. It undermined, shifted, and dismantled everything piece by piece to the amusement of political opponents and the despair of observers on the inside. It tried out newly gained power on the most important officials like a native chieftain testing a rifle on his slaves. This was the new spirit that prevailed until, in the black hour of final resistance, the state disappeared. 3. Following the assault by our English insurgents, there came, of necessity, the uprising of the Marxist proletariat in November of 1918. The scene changed from the halls of the Reichstag to the city streets. Encouraged by the mutiny of the Home Army, the readers of the radical press broke loose, even though they had been abandoned by their leaders, who were wise enough by now to be only half convinced of their cause. Following the revolution of stupidity came the revolution of vulgarity. Once again, it was not the people who initiated action, not even the socialistically trained masses. It was a mob led by the vermin of journalism. The true socialists were still engaged in the final struggle at the military front, or lay in the mass graves of Europe. They had not risen up in 1914, and now they were being betrayed. It was the most senseless act in German history. One looks in vain for anything like it in the history of other countries. A Frenchman would justifiably reject a comparison with 1789 as an insult to his nation. Was that the great German Revolution? How drab, how feeble, how utterly void of conviction it all was. Where we expected heroes, we found ex-convicts, journalists, deserters roaming about yelling and stealing, drunk with their own importance and impunity, ruling, deposing, brawling, and writing poetry. It is said that such types have sullied every revolution. Perhaps that is true. But in other revolutions, the entire people rose up with such elemental force that the dregs simply disappeared. Here it was the dregs alone who went into action, not a sign of the great mass, forged into unity by a common idea. The party of Auguste Bebel had militant qualities which distinguished it from the socialism of all other countries. The clattering footsteps of workers' battalions, a calm sense of determination, good discipline, and the courage to die for a transcendent principle. Yet the soul of the party expired when its more intelligent leaders of yesteryear surrendered to the enemy of yesteryear, reactionary Philistinism. They did this out of fear of responsibility, out of fear of succeeding in a cause they had championed for 40 years. They dreaded the moment when they would have to create reality rather than combat it. When this happened, Marxism and socialism, i.e. class theory and collective instinct, parted ways for the first time. Only the Spartacists retained a modicum of integrity. The smarter ones had lost faith in the dogma, but lacked the courage to break with it openly. Thus we witnessed the spectacle of a working class divorced from the people by a few ideas and doctrines learned by rote. Leaders were actually deserters, followers plodded ahead leaderless, and over on the horizon was a book which the followers had never read and which the leaders had never understood in its proper limitations. In a revolution, the victor is never a single class. The common interpretation of 1789 is false. Bourgeoisie is just a word. The true victor, and this cannot be repeated often enough, is the blood, the idea become flesh and spirit, a force that drives the totality onward. The victors of 1789 called themselves the bourgeoisie, but every true Frenchman was then and is today a bourgeois. Every true German is a worker. It is part of his way of life. The Marxists held power, but they gave it up voluntarily. The insurrection came too late for their convictions. The insurrection was a lie. 4. Do we know anything at all about revolution? When Bakunin was opposed in his intention to crown the Dresden Revolt of 1848 by burning all public buildings, he declared, "The Germans are just too stupid for that," and went on his way. The indescribable ugliness of our November days is without precedent. Not one forceful moment, nothing in the least inspiring. Not one great man, no enduring words, no incisive actions, only pettiness, loathsomeness, and folly. No, we are not revolutionaries. No emergency, no party, no press can stir up an anarchic tempest having the same force as that exhibited in the name of order in 1813, 1870, and 1914. This revolution seemed to everyone, except for a handful of fools and opportunists, like the collapse of a building. Perhaps most of all to the socialist leaders themselves. It was a unique situation. They had won suddenly what they had coveted for 40 years, absolute power. And they were miserable. The same soldiers who fought as heroes for 4 years under the black-white-red banner turned spineless and impotent under the red flag. This revolution did not impart fortitude to its adherents. It robbed them of it. The classical site of Western European revolutions is France. The resounding of momentous phrases, streams of blood in the streets, la sainte guillotine, terrifying nights of conflagration, heroic death at the barricades, orgies of the crazed masses. All these things point up the sadistic mentality of this race. The whole repertoire of symbolic words and deeds for the perfect revolution originated in Paris, and we only gave a bad imitation of them. The French showed us in 1871 what a proletarian insurrection looks like in the face of enemy artillery, and this was surely not the only time. The Englishman attempts to persuade the domestic enemy of the weakness of his position. If he is unsuccessful, he simply takes sword or pistol in hand and, eschewing revolutionary melodrama, presents him with the choice. He decapitates his king, for instinct tells him that this is required as a symbol. For him, such a gesture is a sermon without words. The Frenchman does such things out of revanche, for the sheer pleasure of watching a bloody scene. He is titillated by the clever idea of lopping off the royal head. Without human heads impaled on spikes, aristocrats hanging from lampposts, and priests slaughtered by housewives, we would be frustrated. He does not care at all about the outcome of such days of grandeur. The Englishman desires the goal, the Frenchman desires the means. What was our desire? All that we accomplished was a travesty of both techniques. We produced pedants, schoolboys, and gossips in Paulskirche and in Weimar, petty demonstrations in the streets, and in the background a nation looking on with faint interest. A real revolution must involve the whole people, one outcry, one brazen act, one rage, one goal. The real German socialist revolution took place in 1914. It transpired in legitimate and military fashion. In its true significance, scarcely comprehensible to the average person, it will gradually overshadow the sordid events of 1918 and make them appear as phases in the long-range development of the revolution itself. And yet popular historical opinion will not give prominence to this revolution, but to the November uprising. It is easy to imagine how, under ideal conditions, a true proletarian revolution might have started at the time. This only indicates the glaring cowardice and mediocrity of those who declared themselves in support of the proletarian cause. Great revolutions are fought with blood and iron. What might the great popular leaders, the Independents and the Jacobins, have done in this situation? And what did the Marxists do? They had the power. They could have done just about anything. One great man from the ranks of the people could have had the entire nation behind him. Yet never has a mass movement been more thoroughly ruined by the incompetence of its leaders and their lieutenants. The Jacobins were prepared to sacrifice everything because they sacrificed themselves. Marchez volontiers, les pieds dans le sang et dans les larmes, as Saint-Just put it. They did battle against the majority within the nation, and against half of Europe at the front. They swept everything along with them. They created armies out of nothing. They won victories without officers or weapons. If only their parrot-like German imitators had unfurled the red banner at the front and declared war to the death against capitalism. If only they had set an example by staking their lives in the struggle. Had they made this choice, they would not only have breathed life into the mortally exhausted army and its officers, they would have won over the entire West as well. It was a moment when personal sacrifice would have spelled victory. But they ducked out. Instead of stepping to the command of red legions, they grabbed top positions in well-salaried workers' soviets. Instead of winning the battle against capitalism, they conquered window panes and liberated stores of provisions and state treasuries. Instead of selling their lives, they sold their uniforms. This revolution failed from cowardice. Now it is too late. We shall never recover what was lost during the armistice. The mass ideal degenerated into a series of corrupt wage deals, forced through without reciprocal promises. In their valor, these revolutionaries did not shrink from sponging on the rest of the people, on the farmers, the civil servants, and the intellectuals. Instead of initiating action, they bellowed the slogans Soviet, dictatorship, and republic so often that within 2 years' time they will have become a laughingstock. The only action that occurred was the overthrow of the monarchy. And yet a republican form of government has nothing at all to do with socialism. All this proves that, as opposed to the rest of the people, and it turns out that it is opposed to them, the Fourth Estate, which is actually a negative concept, is incapable of constructive action. It proves that if this was indeed the socialist revolution, then the proletariat cannot be its most effective champion. No matter what is yet to ensue, this question is now definitely resolved. The social class trained by Auguste Bebel for the decisive struggle has failed right down the line, and it has failed for all time because momentum of this sort, once lost, can never be regained. A grand passion cannot be replaced by embitterment. From now on, let there be no illusions among the advocates of the erstwhile socialist program. They have completely alienated the valuable element of the working class. Formerly the leaders of a great movement, they will one day find themselves as big-mouthed heroes of street brawls in the suburbs. From the sublime to the ridiculous is but one step. 5. Such, then, was the great German Revolution, the event that was heralded in poetry and song for generations. It was a spectacle of such fearful irony that decades must pass before the Germans can see it in its true light. A revolution that succeeded in overthrowing its own aims, and that now aims for something else, without knowing exactly what. Let us imagine for the moment that we are citizens of the future looking back on these three revolutions, the honorable English Revolution, the superb French Revolution, and the absurd German Revolution. We can conclude that through these events the three latest peoples of the Western world attempted to achieve the three ideal forms of existence enunciated in the famous motto, liberty, equality, and brotherhood. These ideals appear in the political programs of liberal parliamentarism, social democracy, and authoritarian socialism. In each case, it seemed that such ideals were a new concept for these peoples, whereas in reality the ideals were the purest and most extreme expression of their whole personal and immutable patterns of life. In antiquity, the purpose of revolutions was to establish the basis on which a stable existence was at all feasible. Despite the outward signs of passionate struggle that accompanied them, they were all defensive actions. No one, from Cleon on down to Spartacus, ever thought to look beyond the immediate crisis toward a general reordering of ancient society. The three great Western revolutions, on the other hand, have dealt essentially with the problem of power. Is the will of the individual to be subjected to the common will, or vice versa? Once a decision was reached, the intention was to force it on the whole world. English instinct decided that power belongs to the individual. Life is a free-for-all. Every man for himself. The stronger man wins. The English opted for liberalism and the belief in the inequality of men. The state was to exist no longer. Everyone was to fight his own battles, for in the end it would benefit all. The instinct of the French decided that all men are equal, and hence power should belong to no one. There was to be no such things as subordination, and therefore no order and no state. In fact, nothing at all. This theoretical ideal of anarchy has in practice been periodically reaffirmed in 1799, 1851, 1871, and 1918 by the despotic rule of generals and presidents. Both of these systems may be called democracy, but for very different reasons. Neither had anything to do with class struggle in the Marxist sense. The English Revolution, which produced the type of citizen who leads his life in private and is responsible only to himself, directed its action against the state rather than the estates. The secular and religious powers that sustained the state were abolished, and in their place came a reliance on the advantages of England's insular location. The estates still exist today, recognized and respected by all, even by the workers, who honor them instinctively. Only the French Revolution was a genuine class conflict, but it was a conflict between social rather than economic ranks. In France, the privileged few were integrated with the homogeneous mass of the people, the bourgeoisie. In contrast to these two, the German Revolution grew out of a theory. German, or more precisely, Prussian instinct declares that power belongs to the totality. The individual serves the totality, which is sovereign. The king, as Frederick the Great maintained, is only the first servant of his people. Each citizen is assigned his place in the totality. He receives orders and obeys them. This is authoritarian socialism as we have known it since the 18th century. It is essentially non-liberal and anti-democratic, at least when compared with English liberalism and French democracy. But it is also clear that the Prussian instinct is anti-revolutionary. The task of transposing the state organism from the 18th to the 19th century, a process that might be described as liberal and democratic, but in an entirely different Prussian sense, was one for organizational talent. But the radical theoretical mind invented a fourth estate, out of a portion of the citizenry, which was senseless in a country of farmers and civil servants. Theory gave the name Third Estate to the most numerous segment of the population, the one containing a motley variety of occupations and professions, thus singling it out as an element in a class conflict. And finally, it made the socialist idea a prerogative of the Fourth Estate. With these abstractions in mind, the theorists set out in November 1918 to achieve what had actually been in existence for a long time. Beclouded by slogans, they failed to apprehend the actual state of affairs, and in the end succeeded in destroying it. They not only ruined the state, they also crushed Bebel's party, the masterpiece of a truly socialist man of action, a genuinely authoritarian and militant organization, the best weapon the workers had in their battle to infuse the state with the spirit of the new century. That is what makes this revolution so desperately comical. It succeeded admirably in setting its own house on fire. What the German people had promised itself in 1914. What it had already begun to bring about, slowly and dispassionately. What millions of men had died for on the battlefields. All this was denied and destroyed. And then embarrassment set in. Nobody knew how to convey the impression that an active revolution was actually taking place. Such an explanation was urgent, because the workers, who had expected something quite different, viewed their leaders with increasing distrust. The constant barking of slogans into thin air was no solution. 6. And so the German Michel, that inveterate liberal, set the overturned throne aright and seated himself upon it. The guileless heir to this revolutionary prank, intensely anti-socialist by nature, he was equally repelled by conservatives and Spartacists, and fearful that these groups might one day discover what they have in common. He was Schiller's Karl Moor in an easy chair, tolerant of all political faiths, including the most questionable ones, provided that they upheld the Republican parliamentarian democratic principle, provided that they were long on talk and short on action, provided that they kept out of his sight such authoritarian qualities as resoluteness, audacity, and disciplined obedience. To protect himself, our good friend Michel beckoned to the one outstanding personality of the November episode, and it is not insignificant that this man was a dyed-in-the-wool soldier, whereupon Michel immediately reverted to his old distrust of the military spirit, without which the Weimar farce would have ended swiftly. This sorry display of ignorance, incompetence, weakness, and indignity should suffice to discredit parliamentarism forever in Germany. Under the black-red-yellow banner, which has now become the everlasting symbol of folly, we witnessed a repetition of all the stupidities of 1848, when politics was likewise not action, but empty talk and theorizing. The liberal of 1917 was in his glory. He had his armistice, his League of Nations, his peace, and his government. Michel doffed his cap with a smile in the expectation that John Bull would be simply splendid. But his smile turned to tears as he signed the papers. John Bull was using a crazed Frenchman as his business manager. In the heart of the German people, Weimar is doomed. It is not even a laughing matter. The ratification of the Constitution has been greeted by absolute indifference. Its authors thought that the dawn of parliamentarism had arrived, whereas even in England it is rapidly growing dusk. Such as it is, the English system presupposes the presence of strong personalities, distributed between two very old, mutually complementary political groups. In Weimar, where there was a desperate lack of strong personalities, it was believed that political opposition was the very hallmark of the parliamentarian system. And so they dutifully started opposing a government that no longer existed. It was like a schoolroom when the teacher is away. The future will most certainly look on this episode with profound contempt. The year 1919 is the nadir of German dignity. The Frankfurt Paulskirche contained honest fools and academicians, altogether a comical collection of eggheads. In Weimar, one had the feeling that clever operators were behind the scenes. It makes no difference whether the acting politicians were conspirators themselves, or just the dupes of conspirators. These parties confused the fatherland all too often with their own advantage. What we now have is a pre-Thermidor Directoire. Woe to us if we have to make up for for the phase we passed over. It is equally certain that the dismal comedy of this counterfeit revolution will end. The outside world is preparing for a new phase of the World War. Things happen fast these days. In our National Assembly, a degenerate Reichstag, the politicians are using the ruins of our demolished state to build a makeshift shelter. Soon the only activities there will be graft and fraudulent dealings in salaries, merchandise, and official positions. Meanwhile, other people are beginning to think differently about the events of last year. They are comparing what is now being constructed with what was there previously. They are beginning to understand that in reality, a people can never choose between different types of government. It can choose the outer trappings of government, but not the essential thing, the spirit of government, even though public opinion constantly confuses the two. What gets written into a constitution is never essential. The important thing is how the instinct of the people interprets it. The English Parliament governs according to unwritten and, in part, quite undemocratic laws that have evolved through long practice, and that is precisely why it is so successful. 7. Make no mistake, the revolution is not yet ended. No matter how you interpret it, as senseless or significant, as a failure or as an auspicious beginning, as the prelude to a world revolution, or merely as a mob uprising in a single country, the fact remains that we are in the midst of a crisis. And like everything organic, like every disease, this crisis will follow a more or less typical course that cannot be influenced by artificial means. In the light of this fact, such ethical distinctions as just cause and treachery are quite worthless. From now on, revolutionaries and counter-revolutionaries alike must have expert knowledge of human nature. They must be able to grasp and exploit the immediate situation with deliberateness and sobriety. Instead of practicing the ancient art of diplomatic psychology on diplomats and sovereigns, they must learn to apply it to the mass mind, which responds much more rapidly to errors of tact. Popular leaders, even those of mediocre intelligence, have an infallible knack for this sort of thing. The lack of instinct shown by our present political leaders is perhaps best explained by the typical German thoroughness of their theoretical training. The truly popular leader must have an absolutely accurate sense of the duration, the tempo, the rhythm, the crescendo and decrescendo of each phase of the situation. One false move and he will lose all control. What is more, he must know exactly which factors he can control and which ones he must allow to run their course, waiting out the time when he can exploit them in a broader context or, by skillful manipulation, steer them in the direction he deems necessary. Great revolutionaries have always possessed the tactical know-how of great generals. For an army, the prevailing mood of a single hour can spell victory or defeat. To the theoretical mind, the most important part of a revolution is its beginning, when forces are arrayed in clear and definite opposition to each other. The skeptical mind prefers, however, to study the final phase of a revolution, for it has much greater significance and is psychologically more instructive. Matters of state have never been so complicated as they are today. The outbreak of the German Revolution was at the same time the betrayal of our nation to the enemy. As a result, our emotional attitude toward Marxism differs radically from that of all other countries. In 1792, nation and revolution were one and the same. In 1919, they are opposites. The English Revolution confined itself to an island, and the French insurgents, owing to their bravery in the field, were able to keep the situation in hand at all times. In our own revolution, each new phase occurs under pressure of foreign designs. Paris, London, and New York are all involved, not with their labor movements, but with their armies, which they will send against us should the German Revolution take on undesirable forms. That is the way our Marxists wanted it, and they had better be prepared to take the consequences. Besides the Spartacists' hand grenades and the machine guns of the Reichswehr, we have the French army of occupation and the English fleet to reckon with. Our newspapers are full of heroic Bolshevist pronouncements. Every day we can take our pick among massacres of Western capitalists on the editorial pages. Journalism is no substitute for a true revolutionary front line, backed up by heavy artillery. The longer they preach about world revolution, the less threatening it becomes. There is mostly anger, and very little confidence, in the revolutionary talk we hear and read these days. It should be pointed out that not even the Russian revolutionaries made cowardice in the face of the enemy a cardinal point in their program, and it must not be forgotten that many of those who participated in the November insurrection did so not out of enthusiasm for this or that political solution, but because they were hungry and desperate, because their nerves could no longer stand the strain. The decisions reached at Versailles have caused the state of war to continue. But how much longer can the psychological effect of those decisions be an aid, rather than an obstacle, to the designs of the Marxists? The general strike has outlived its usefulness as a weapon. The past year has dissipated whatever energies the Marxist movement had to start with, and at this point revitalization is out of the question. The absurd goings-on in the National Assembly are bound to produce nothing but contempt for the parliamentary idea. There comes a time in every revolution when the people will settle for peace and domestic order at any price, when no revolutionary minority can persuade them, not even with the most drastic methods, to make fundamental political decisions. When this point is reached, the revolution has virtually come to an end, and no one has the power to avoid its effects or postpone them. We need only compare the actual number of votes cast in the Jacobin plebiscite with those cast at the installation of Bonaparte as first consul to see that the French people had finally had enough of the revolution. We are now rapidly approaching this terminal point in the German Revolution, and the patience of the German people will be exhausted even more quickly. Nevertheless, it is not only the confirmed advocates of radical change who are in danger of committing errors. Their equally confirmed opponents can make mistakes just as easily. A strong but indeterminate feeling of disappointment is still a long way from the actual decision to capitulate. The sense of political failure that is widespread in the German people today is like an open wound that is sensitive to the touch. If the opposition were to make the slightest attempt to end the revolution by violence, they would release in the people an irresistible wave of bitterness and fury, such as the radicals themselves are no longer capable of arousing. We would experience a protest of contagious force, a sudden quickening of the popular mood which resolute leaders could exploit for action of a very drastic sort. While it is true that such a development would not affect the duration or essential meaning of historical events, it would nonetheless alter their form and intensity to a decisive degree. Things could get very bloody. We have now reached a crucial stage in this revolution, a time when the inscrutable mass mind could confuse even the most knowledgeable observers by giving a surprise twist to the course of events, as it has in previous great revolutions. Does the tense silence that prevails in some quarters of our country indicate the presence of an indomitable will? Is the irritable clamoring we hear from other quarters to be interpreted as a growing awareness of final defeat? Is it too late for the insurgents to take action? Too early for the opposition? It is common knowledge that certain political structures which seem invincible at the moment can, after 2 years' time, fall of their own weight. That was true in 1918 and will again be true, though with a nearly opposite effect, in the near future. Yesterday's courtiers can be the regicides of today, and today's regicides the princes of the future. In such times no one can be sure of how long his convictions can endure. But to what unit of time should we now adapt our thinking? Should we start thinking in months or in years? The tempo and duration of the German Revolution were determined by the time and manner in which it began. No one may have knowledge of these factors, yet they exist and they operate with the inevitability of destiny. Whoever tries to interfere with them will perish. The Girondists perished because they thought that the climax of the revolution was behind them. Babeuf met his fate because he believed that the climax was yet to come. The intrinsic nature of the revolution would remain intact even if new wars were to break out, even if a great personality were to make his appearance. Such occurrences might cause a sudden and complete change in the historical appearance of the German Revolution, which is all that matters to the ordinary observer. But their true function would be to confirm its deeper and more essential significance. A great man is one who understands the spirit of his time, who is himself the incarnation of that spirit. He does not come to destroy, but to fulfill it. Let us now investigate the origins of the spirit of German socialism.